My name is Kieran James. Today I'm going to be talking about the psychological responses to sporting injuries. Starting off, all you need to know about psychological responses to sporting injuries. So psychological responses are always going to be present when an athlete receives an injury. Some would say these are even more severe than, the physiological side of injuries. An example of this is Ryan Mason, who was a footballer playing for Hull City, who actually suffered a severe career-ending head injury back in 2017. This was obviously extreme injury, and he actually clashed heads with an opponent. This saw him obviously had to retire at a very young age of 26. This actually saw him need to receive surgery as well on his head, where they completely cut his head open. Had to completely fix his skull because he had a fractured skull. And then obviously had to put his head back together. Obviously, this was an extremely traumatic experience, and he obviously experienced some key extreme psychological responses during this time. So yeah, that's that. So moving on, the first sort of theory we're going to look at is the stages of grief. So there are 5 key stages of grief, and this was discovered by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. And this is a very prominent and common theory, and many athletes believe that they will go through this. So as you can see on the screen, there are 5 key stages. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, the acceptance stage. And so that's a brief overview of this. So let's move on to the first stage, which is the denial and isolation stage. So this is where when the athlete first receives that injury, this is what they will do straight away, sort of thing. So straight away, the athlete will be sort of in denial, and they will be sort of telling everyone no, and it's all okay, and they are fine. This is because they don't really want to admit and actually face reality of what has just happened. So this will then cause them to actually go into an isolation stage where they will physically isolate from, the people around them, such as their teammates, their coaches, physios, people like this, and people that actually want to help them, leaving their family and close ones. This can be an extremely lonely stage, and is actually a very hard stage for an athlete. Moreover, most sort of majority of athletes will go through this. It happens right after they receive an injury. This is very common when an athlete or a footballer will receive an injury, and the physios run onto the pitch, and the athlete will say they're fine, and they want to carry on even though they're not. And they're doing more damage than what they should be doing. So the second stage of this theory is the anger stage. So this is where the athlete starts to realise a bit more what's happening, the fact that they actually might be injured. So they will actually start to get really angry, become really bothered about what's going on. So this obviously happens all the time with athletes, because obviously no athlete wants to be injured. And they'll actually get really frustrated and stuff, and they'll start blaming the people around them and stuff like that. This stage is obviously is seen all the time and stuff. Some common examples of this would be sort of when obviously athletes, they might argue with each other, or they might blame people, or they might try and tell a physio that is not the case if they're told they've got a certain injury. And it is obviously a very common stage, and it's just natural and raw emotion from an athlete after being told they're injured and they're going to be out for a period of time. Moving on to stage 3 is the bargaining stage. This is where the athlete sort of starts to calm down from the second stage, the anger stage, and they will actually start to question themselves, and they'll start to rethink what actually happened during the actual injury itself. They might start saying to themselves, "Oh, what could I have done differently? Should I have worn this leg, this knee brace, this and that?" And they'll start to sort of question themselves, and they'll say how they shouldn't have got injured and how it was their fault, and they could blame themselves. For example, a footballer might pull a muscle, while playing or whatever, and then they might look back at it and say, "Oh, they should have warmed up better, or they should have done this and stuff." And this is also a very common stage, and you see it all of the time. And it's just another way for an athlete to sort of distract themselves and take their mind off what's actually just happened, and sort of blame something rather than just accepting what has really happened. Moving on to the 4th stage, this is a depression stage. So this can be quite a long-lasting stage, and depending on the extent of the injury, sort of sort of will depend on whether the athlete will go through this or how long they'll go through this for. So this is obviously where the athlete is very sad and actually starts to realise even more what's actually happened to them and how long they will be out for. So this is when they'll sort of, be very lonely. They won't be playing and stuff, and they'll start to hit them that they might actually be out for quite a long period of time. So so for example, if like a basketballer wants to do their ACL, then they might reach this stage and be like, oh, like they might actually be out they might realise they'll be out for the whole season, and they'll obviously realise that they won't play for a good 12 months, and almost the championships, the playoffs, the finals, all of the big games, which can really sort of mess them up mentally and play tricks in their mind, and can actually, in some severe cases, even put athletes in very bad situations, as sort of aside from sport and actually their personal life, and sort of put them in some bad places they really don't want to be in, and actually hurt the people around them. So moving on, the fifth and final stage, the stage of grief model, which is arguably the most important stage, is actually the acceptance stage. This is obviously where the athlete finally comes to terms with what has actually happened. They've gone through all the previous stages and actually finally get to the point where they can actually sit there and accept what's actually happened, what they're going to do to move forward to, obviously get back to where they should be. For example, a rugby player who might have had this, they might have received an extreme injury involved in the head, obviously was getting a scrum or something like that. And it could take them years of going through obviously all the previous stages, the depression, etc. And they might finally realise that they're not going to play again, and that's okay. And rugby's not obviously all of their life sort of thing. But obviously this is probably the most important stage, is obviously it finally allows the athlete to be free and sort of move on in a way. So now moving on, we're going to look at the analysis of obviously different kinds of injuries and how this model will affect sort of different sort of kinds of injuries. So starting off sort of this stage of grief model, so someone who experiences a ligament sprain, who wouldn't be looking to be out for like very long at all, maybe sort of 2 to 3 months or whatever, depending on how bad the sprain sort of is. This might look at on the model. This might sort of see them go through sort of 3 stages, maybe the first denial and isolation stage or the anger stage. Then finally get to the acceptance stage. But and they'd obviously go through this fairly quickly. But on the other hand, if they experience like a sort of a career-ending injury or a life-threatening injury, like a head injury or a spinal injury, then they might actually go through obviously all 5 stages. The denial and isolation, the anger, the depression, all of this sort of stuff. And obviously the depression might last longer, and they could suffer for years, obviously, as a result of this injury. And then this obviously this model will affect them for much longer, rather than something sort of the short term as a ligament sprain as such. With that being said, I do believe that on the whole, this model is very accurate and doesn't miss too much out of what an athlete will go through, and does cover a range of perspectives and thoughts when an athlete is injured. So yeah, that's that. And now we're actually going to move on to the. Now actually going to move on to the. So now actually going to move on to the integrated model for psychological responses to injuries. So this was created by Wise, Bonstall, Smith, Schaefer, and Murray. In 1998. This is when this model was developed. It describes 3 interdependent responses which athletes make following an injury. Targeting all 3 of these responses can help maintain the motivation and self-belief within that athlete to come back stronger and get back to fully fitness. All of these obviously 3 stages play a part in the athlete, and it can be deemed as sort of a cycle. An athlete will go through the cycle to obviously help them get back to where they should be. So starting off with the sort of, as you can see on the screen here, the cognitive appraisal, which is where the goal adjustment starts. The rate of perceived recovery, self-perceptions, belief and attributions, the sense of loss of belief, and cognitive coping. So this is sort of the initial stage when the athlete first gets injured. And, they're trying to just cope and adjust the short-term goals, this and that. moving on to there, sort of gets the emotional response. This is where sort of the emotions start to kick in, the fear, the tension, the anger. This can sort of lead to the depression, the frustration, the grief of the injury itself. And then this will sort of start to turn into hopefully some positive attitude, emotional coping of what's just happened. And finally, this actually leads to the behavioural response where, they start to take actual actions of what's just happened. So, the goal adjustment will start, the longer term goals, the rate perceived recovery starts, the self-perceptions, the belief in attribution, the sense of loss of relief, these key sort of things. And it's actually deemed that this will be a cycle. So they might go to this and they might go back to the cognitive, and they'll just keep going through the cycle until eventually obviously get back to where they need to be, until back to fully fitness. So, so here the cognitive appraisal is what we think about the injury and its relations to our lives and goals, e.g. how long we perceive recovery to be. And then moving on, the emotional response. This is how we feel about the injury itself, and how our emotions sort of play a part in what we feel. And then obviously how our mood and energy is effective. Sort of e.g. here, the positive attitude to recovery, or fear and tension. And finally, the behavioural response is sort of what we do in response to the injury and the functional loss, sort of doing rehab programs, working with the physios, doing the extra hours to sort of come back as fast as they can. So, this is sort of the integrative model explained. So the integrative model is obviously broken down into the 3 main stages. Obviously, these sort of consist of, the cognitive appraisal, the emotional response, the behavioural response. Sort of as said before, that the cognitive appraisal is obviously the initial stage after the injury, where obviously the panic obviously affecting the athlete, and they sort of start to quickly adjust the short-term goals, and also all these thoughts going through their head. And then this sort of moves fairly quickly into the emotional response, where their emotions come into play and they start playing tricks and start worrying the athlete. And finally, obviously, it goes into the behavioural response, where the athlete will actually start to do something about, the previous stages, and will try and get back to sort of their fitness, and will try and recover as quickly as they can. Sort of all these stages are obviously key, and they all link in together, so obviously to help the athlete get back where they should be. And obviously it is that sort of cycle of going through all of these stages. So after looking at all of these, let me just check this quickly. Yeah, okay. So after looking at both of these types of theories, my opinions and beliefs are, obviously, I do believe that the stages of grief theory is more effective than the other theory, obviously. But obviously that's my opinion, and I do believe this because I believe that there are 5 clear stages which all allow for any kind of injury, short term, long term, whether it's a ligament sprain or, whether it is that head injury or spinal injury. I do believe that this does provide, a more of a range, and it does cover more when an athlete will go through that recovery time after receiving an injury. I also believe that this has been slightly more proven, and we've seen it a lot more than athletes, and what it actually looks like for an athlete to go through this stage. So yeah, that's sort of my opinion on it, and how athletes are effective, sort of thing. So yeah, thank you for listening. And that's all.